Why I Reject the Madman Hitler Myth is the title of a video by Tick History. It's a debate among historians whether or not Hitler had a mental illness, and I don't know the first thing about that debate, so I'm not going to weigh in on it. However, while I don't know how to psychoanalyze Hitler, I do know how to recognise a logical fallacy, and oh boy, this video really is something else. So to be absolutely clear, I don't know if Hitler had a mental illness. That is not the point of this video. The point is to show you what a terrible argument looks like, so you don't make the same mistakes.
If Hitler is insane, then that means that he's got a mental disability. And since we don't chastise disabled people for being disabled, we actually feel sorry for them because it's not their fault that they're disabled, then we must therefore feel sorry for Hitler for being disabled, since it's not his fault. And everything he did can be dismissed as an accident, since his disability was what drove him to do what he did, and he can't take responsibility for his actions since he couldn't control his disability. Therefore, if he was a madman, what happened wasn't his fault. So, the irony of all of this is that those of you who are saying that I'm defending Hitler are themselves defending Hitler.
This is the appeal to the consequences fallacy. An example of an appeal to the consequences fallacy would be if I said, if I am shot, I will die. I don't want to die, so I will not get shot. In Tick's case, he is saying, if Hitler has a mental illness, we have to clear him of all responsibility. I don't want to clear him of all responsibility, therefore he did not have a mental illness. In other words, saying that if Hitler had a mental illness, that clears him of his crimes, does not mean that Hitler did not have a mental illness. And some of you may be saying, Ben, Tick isn't saying that it proves Hitler did not have a mental illness. He's saying that if you say Hitler has a mental illness, you're defending Hitler. And that's a perfectly valid opinion, but in which case you're basically admitting that 4 minutes into the video, you still haven't provided any evidence to back up your claims. And to be clear, no, I don't think that calling Hitler a madman clears him of responsibility. I don't care how many personality disorders Hitler had. I think that genocide is a crime that warrants the death penalty under any and all circumstances, regardless of if the perpetrator was crazy or not. And I think that if the Soviets had caught Hitler, they should have shot him. Because even if he is a madman, that doesn't change anything in my mind. Tick then goes on to say that while Nazism is an evil ideology, they're often not too far gone, and it is still possible to change their minds.
The same applies to the neo-Nazis of today. People are quick to call them insane or whatever, but I don't think that's necessarily true or the right strategy. I think the ideology of National Socialism is bad and has corrupted these people. They are misguided. They have fallen for the ideology for various reasons, but by explaining why their core beliefs are incorrect, we can convert them away from National Socialism so that they can be normal people again. And some have actually done that. They've watched my videos on National Socialism and realised that I actually had a point, and that they then stopped being Nazi or fascist.
And I absolutely agree with that. He's cooking here. As long as Tick is making sure there's less Nazis in the world, he's doing us all a favour. Next up, Tick says that people like to dismiss fascism as mad, because otherwise they would have to research fascism and learn what it is. And they don't want to research fascism because they're afraid that if they research fascism, they'll become fascists.
They think if they read up about this ideology, they'll somehow get converted into being a fascist and then end up being Hitler. Well, no, that won't happen.
Tick, the reason that I have not done much research into fascism is because I just don't care. I'm not afraid of becoming a fascist. I think that if I did research into fascism, I would hate fascism more when I realised just how truly evil it was. The reason I don't do much research into fascism is simply because I'm not interested in the complex intricacies of Mussolini's ideology. Tick also doesn't give a single example of someone saying that if you research fascism, you become a fascist. At the start of the video, he does give comments as examples of what people believe. Therefore, he clearly looks for comments to provide evidence of people actually saying this stuff. Therefore, presumably he looked for a comment of someone saying, if you research fascism, you'll become a fascist, and he just couldn't find one. I will point out a small contradiction in his argument here. Play the clip.
Many are of the opinion, including numerous historians, that we can't understand this guy at all. He's so evil and so monstrous that we aren't even on the same wavelength as him. He's not human, and since we are human, well, most of us are, how can we possibly understand Hitler's reasoning? They think if they read up about this ideology, they'll somehow get converted into being a fascist and then end up being Hitler.
Okay, so people say they could never ever be a fascist, but are afraid that if they research fascists, they will become one. Maybe Tick has a way of reconciling these ideas, but I can't think of a way to reconcile them, so Tick, if you're watching this, please clarify what you actually mean.
By dismissing Hitler as a monster-raving loony bourgeoisie, what you're doing is saying, he's not human, he's a monster, and since none of us are monsters, Hitler was a one-off and such things will never happen again.
Nobody thinks that. When people talk about Hitler, I've never heard anyone say that he will never happen again. Instead, they talk about how to analyse Hitler's rise to power so we can stop it from happening again. That's why history teachers teach about the Reichstag fire, President Hindenburg and the Night of the Long Knives, so we know how to stop it from happening again. Saying Hitler was a madman doesn't imply that it will never happen again. It acknowledges that crazy people exist and are dangerous and they can take over countries. Let me ask you this, Tick. How many times have you heard Putin being compared to Hitler and Mussolini? Because I've heard that comparison made a lot. When Trump was elected in the USA, people freaked out, thinking we were going to see a repeat of the Third Reich in America. You can debate all day long about whether or not Trump is actually a fascist tyrant, but the fact remains that many people view him that way. Why? Because we painfully remember what happened when Hitler rose to power, and we don't want it to happen again. So no, I just don't think anyone believes that Hitler was a one-off and will never happen again just because he was crazy.
History repeats, and the reason it does is because we've dismissed Hitler and others as some mythical monsters who we just can't possibly understand.
Credit where credit is due, I do sort of agree with this point. Not everyone thinks like this, because there are definitely some people who think Trump is a fascist. A lot of people do seem to have this notion that their country could never elect a Hitler equivalent. But I think that whether or not they believe Hitler had a mental disorder, that doesn't really change things. Even if they don't dismiss Hitler as crazy, it can still be hard for people to realise that yes, any country could elect a fascist. That fact isn't going to change if they realise Hitler was sane. He then spends over 6 minutes talking about how Hitler's military strategy wasn't that bad, and he seems to reason that because his strategy wasn't that bad, therefore, Hitler doesn't have a mental illness.
Literally watch any of the previous videos on oil, logistics and anything else. The Africa Corps could barely be supplied as is, and more forces would just make the overall situation even worse. Besides, the Middle East didn't have much oil at the time unless you drive all the way to South Iraq and Iran, then somehow transport it back across the Mediterranean when the Axis didn't have much shipping capacity and infrastructure for that anyway.
When a psychologist diagnoses you with a mental illness, they ask you how you think, act and feel. They say stuff like, how do you react when someone says or does this, that and this? They ask you what happened in your childhood, and you say, my father punished me severely. They don't ask, how many Russians have you shot this morning? Hitler's military tactics are not an indicator of his mental state. Yet, Tick spends over 6 minutes talking about them. That's why my response video is probably going to end up being considerably shorter than the video I'm debunking. This is because he doesn't say much stuff relevant to the topic, so I don't feel like I have to debunk the irrelevant parts. The one thing from this section I will address is this bit.
A lot of the bad decisions were actually made by his generals, who then blamed Madman Hitler instead of admitting their own mistakes.
So the goal here is to say that Hitler's generals tried to blame Hitler for losing the war by saying he was a madman and therefore had bad tactics. But what is Tick History's evidence for this information? What evidence does he cite?
His generals weren't innocent is basically the point here, as Mango explains so eloquently. The Madman Hitler thing was from the generals to save their asses at the end of the war.
One random comment, well, pardon me, that's irrefutable evidence right there, I'm sorry I doubted you. Can I use a comment as a source now? And he does this loads of times, by the way. Every time he makes a point, he pulls up a comment that agrees with him, as if that adds any credibility. Like, I'm sure if I talked for years about Hitler, I could find at least one comment that agrees with me, but that isn't a credible citation. He does have a sources list, so I checked it, but this sources list isn't a list of sources for his video, it's a list of books that he's read over the course of his life. So this is a bibliography for his entire channel, and I can't really comb through this list of 700 books, so I went on Google to find a source for his claim, and I couldn't find it, but I could find historians who believe that Hitler was mentally ill, and they made that claim based on his behaviour, not because his generals said so. The Mad Hitler myth, as he calls it, did not arise from his generals, but from himself.
Also, here's a long but good quote from historian Ian Kershaw, who holds a similar view on the Madman Hitler idea.
And then, 3 minutes before the end of the video, he finally makes, in my opinion, the only substantive claim in the entire video, and it's a quote from another historian who thinks Hitler didn't have a mental disability. Now, I can't really debunk this. Yes, there are a lot of historians who think that Hitler didn't have a mental disorder, but there are also many historians who think he did. For every historian who supports your position, I can find one to support a conflicting opinion.
Many are of the opinion, including numerous historians, that we can't understand this guy at all. He's so evil and so monstrous that we aren't even on the same wavelength as him.
The only way to really determine if Hitler had a mental disorder would be to analyse his writing and his behaviour, which has led people to different conclusions in the past. If somebody did a good job of making a Why I Reject the Madman Hitler Myth video, I would expect them to do something like that. You know, analyse Hitler's speech patterns and behaviour to determine whether or not he had a disorder. And finally, there is one last thing I have to address in Tick History's video. It's because he keeps bringing this up throughout the entire video, he keeps circling back to it. He keeps repeatedly saying that everybody always calls him a Nazi whenever he said Hitler didn't have a mental illness.
So, by rejecting the Madman Hitler idea, this YouTuber is defending Hitler and is pandering to the neo-Nazis and anti-Semites. Get a swastika tattooed on my forehead, go to my secret Nazi occult meeting on the moon, teach my dog to do the Hitler salute, spell out to the YouTube censors that this list is satirical. Anyone who does understand them, like me, is instantly dismissed as crazy or insane or a secret Nazi and a monster.
So yeah, he's right, there probably are some people who genuinely think that Tick is a Nazi, and I don't, in fact, think that Tick is a Nazi. Firstly, because he said that Hitler should have gone to prison in this video or be executed, and secondly, because he's made several videos explaining why National Socialism is bad. So once again, I don't know whether or not Hitler had a mental disorder. Who knows? However, what I do know is that this is a frickin' terrible video that Tick made here.